Hi, we're here to talk about William Bradford and his history of Plymouth Plantation. Before we do that, we should talk briefly about William Bradford and the kind of person that he was. He grew up with relatives because his parents died quite young. He was taken in by two uncles who had a farm, and they expected him to help with the farm work, but he was always quite sickly. And so he read a lot, especially the Bible and a lot of religious tracts. So uh, at quite a young age, he converted to Puritanism. He was married to a young woman whose family was fairly wealthy, and together they joined the separatist pilgrims in 1620 to sail on the Mayflower to Plymouth, Massachusetts. Bradford was always a very studious and well-educated man, so he was well regarded for his wisdom. He was also very even-handed, and at times when there was some kind of fervor, he kept his cool regularly and dealt with people fairly. And so he was regarded as a good man to lead the colony, and he led the colony of the Pilgrims for 30 years, off and on, during his lifetime. And finally, one thing about William Bradford is that he was lucky. When the Mayflower landed, it was in December in the wintry wilds of Massachusetts. I don't know if you've ever been to Massachusetts in the wintertime. Not the best time to go to the beach. And so many of the colonists fell sick and they had very few resources with them. Bradford himself became ill, but he survived, whereas about 50 of the 100 colonists, settlers, didn't make it. Because of that, he was the man who was really ideally situated to tell us the history of this place called Plymouth. But I don't know what you think about history. History seems to me to be crafted and always have some kind of rhetoric. And so here we are again talking about rhetoric. Bradford uses rhetoric to shape his account, to reveal some things and to conceal other things. And so as you read his few chapters, his 3 or 4 chapters that I asked you to read, watch for his rhetoric and his use of it. For example, in chapter 9, Bradford would have his readers know that God had a direct hand in their voyage and their survival. So this excerpt from chapter 9 begins with a mention of God's providence in his description of a lusty young sailor who regularly insults the Puritans on board, and he tells them how happy he's going to be when they die, and he's going to be joyous to throw their bodies overboard. Yet, as it turns out, he is the one who dies first, and he is the one who's thrown overboard. So it's interesting that Bradford tells us that, but it's also interesting that he says that it pleased God to kill this man. Bradford gives God the full credit for the death of this man, and he says that it was obviously the just hand of God upon him. Later on, he'll describe another young sailor who has a notably different personality. This young sailor was swept overboard during a storm, but in his case, it pleased God that he grabbed hold of a rope and was pulled back on board. This sailor, unlike the previous sailor, actually has a name, or his name is revealed. The first sailor, his name is not revealed. This sailor turns out to be John Howland, and it apparently pleased God that he would survive and become a member in good standing of the Puritan community. So one aspect of Bradford's crafting of the narrative is that he leaves out some information. Why not tell the name of the first sailor who died? And why not tell his audience about the death of his wife, who fell overboard just as they were landing in Cape Cod? That seems like a crucial detail, but he doesn't say anything about that in his history. So he leaves in some details, he puts in others, because it seems like he's building a case. So as you read it, what is the case that Bradford is building? How do you read Bradford's intentions in this history? In this same chapter, he relates his feelings regarding their arrival at Cape Cod. They were surely happy that their voyage was completed, and they gave thanks for God's providence, but they were confronted with a real challenge in this wilderness. As Bradford describes it, what they saw was a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. They had brought very little with them, and they landed in winter, as I mentioned before, with no shelter and few resources. So of course they're going to have challenges, but it's his description of nature that is telling. Hideous, desolate, wild. And the scariest part of that wilderness is the wild men, the Native Americans, that they knew they were going to encounter. So the Puritans feared nature. It was something that had to be tamed and controlled, including the savage people that they would meet. So it's not surprising that he and the Puritans regarded the Wampanoag Indians as a real threat, not as friends, and not even really as people. He could take this attitude even while their very survival depended on this group of people, the Wampanoag natives. And so in chapter 10, the next chapter, we learn that Captain Standish and his soldiers encounter savages. First of all, it's interesting that the Puritans took with them a group of soldiers. And second of all, it's interesting that Bradford would call them savages, not people, not natives, but savages. And it tells us something about his perspective, I think, and the perspective of the of the Puritans as well. So anyway, these savages were the ones who had left behind the baskets of corn that Standish and his men dig up in the village. They find a place where the land has been well tended, and they find a place where there is clearly something buried. They dig it up, they find corn. Bradford tells us that this find was a special providence of God. And later, when the good Captain Standish and his military men have a battle with the natives, Bradford says again that it pleased God to vanquish their enemies. God clearly has a hand in the survival of the Puritans from Bradford's point of view. Now, the Wampanoag Indians would eventually send emissaries to the Puritans, and this native tribe would do a great deal to ensure the survival of the Puritans. But Bradford cannot even bring himself to speak of them in his history, except to describe them as savages. For example, we all know that on the first Thanksgiving, the Indians came with food to help celebrate the first year of life in the colony. When you're the fourth and fifth grade, you relive that every Thanksgiving. You make the hats with the belt buckles, and you make the turkey with your hand, and you talk about all the food that the Pilgrims had, and you know that the natives were there, and we know that the natives were there because we have other witness accounts about the natives coming for that dinner. In Bradford's description of that first Thanksgiving, which I asked you to read, he lists the different kinds of food, but he never mentions that the natives had come to that party. He seems to suggest that only the Puritans were there, and we know for a fact that they weren't. So why leave them out of his history? One way he does include the natives in his description, one way that he does include the natives is his description of the massacre of the Pequot Indians. Now, this tribe of warriors were pesky. They were tribes that attacked other tribes and anybody who really might have something that they wanted. So the way that the Pequot Indians lived was that they would accept tribute from the other native groups around, including the Narragansett Indians, including the Mohegan Indians. And as long as they got this tribute from those tribes, they would not attack them. And so, as you can imagine, the native tribes who lived around the Pequots did not really care for them. But the Pequots had also attacked some Puritan settlers who had gotten a little too close to what they considered was their land. And so there was a great deal of anger and resentment toward them all around. Bradford, who leaves out the Indians mostly, is happy to relate of the attack upon the Pequot Indians. He says at the very beginning of his account that he won't give the specifics, and then he does just that. He tells of the affair with such detail that reading of the account could really make a person sick. So what actually happens, what he doesn't explain, but what actually happens historically, was that the Puritans sent two soldiers, Captains Mason and Underhill, with some soldiers to wipe out the Pequots. It had gotten so bad that there was no question that the Pequots just had to go away permanently. And the Puritans had decided this. So these British soldiers were joined by two groups of Indians, some from the Narragansett tribe and some from the Mohegan tribe. And their job was to guide the soldiers to where the Pequots were and to help them kill some of the Pequots. Now, the Narragansetts and the Mohegans, when they went to battle, they thought it would be a battle for honor, and some of the Pequots might get killed, but that's just the way it was going to be. But not all of them would be killed. That wasn't their intention. When the attack begins, however, the Narragansetts and the Mohegans were horrified at what the British did. As Bradford describes it in that chapter that I asked you to read, they set fire to the walls of the fort around the Pequot people, and then they ran inside and also set fire to all the buildings and structures inside. So the place was just ablaze, and it was so hot that the fire melted the bowstrings of the natives, and it was melting the people inside. They were surrounded all around by soldiers who were shooting at them, and so there was nowhere to go, and so they just burned alive. And Bradford mentions the pools of blood and the stench. At the end of the attack, there were only a few Pequots who actually survived, and so those remaining Pequots went to the Mohawk tribe to ask for help, and the Mohawks either killed them or enslaved them. And so essentially that's the end of a group of people. It's genocide. It's the destruction of an entire group of people committed by the Puritans. And what Bradford says about it is that they gave thanks to God, and this is a quotation, who had wrought so wonderfully for them and gave them a speedy victory. So even in genocide, God stands by the Puritans, or so Bradford would have us believe. There's a great deal of rhetoric in this history. So from the sections that you've been given, what do you make of Bradford's rhetoric?